Story 1. My name is Owen, and back in the autumn of 2022, I was a 19-year-old college student living in a historic town near Savannah, Georgia. Like many teenagers with too much free time on their weekends, my friends and I were heavily into a hobby known as urban exploration, or urbex. We loved finding old, decaying structures that had been forgotten by time, breaking past the rusted gates, and documenting the history inside with our digital cameras. It was always an incredible adrenaline rush, and for the most part, the only dangers we ever faced were unstable floorboards, rusty nails, or the occasional aggressive stray animal. That all changed when we discovered the Blackwood Estate. The Blackwood Estate was a massive, 3-story, Victorian mansion situated at the dead end of a heavily overgrown gravel road, completely isolated deep within a dense pine forest. Local urban legends suggested that the mansion had been completely abandoned since the late 1980s after the wealthy family who owned it vanished under mysterious circumstances. One cool October Saturday afternoon, my friends Liam, Maya, and I decided to pack our backpacks with high-powered flashlights, spare camera batteries, and basic first aid kits to go explore the property. We arrived around 3 in the afternoon, leaving our car hidden half a mile away so we wouldn't draw any unwanted attention from the local sheriff's deputies. The mansion looked absolutely magnificent yet incredibly ominous through the trees. The white paint had completely peeled away, leaving the dark, weathered wood exposed to the elements. Most of the massive glass windows on the first floor were heavily boarded up with thick plywood, and the wraparound porch was partially collapsed. We walked around the perimeter of the structure for 10 minutes until we found a small basement window that had been shattered. Liam crawled through first, followed closely by Maya and myself. We clicked on our flashlights, the powerful beams cutting through a thick layer of floating dust and heavy cobwebs. The interior of the house was a frozen time capsule. As we ascended the rotting wooden stairs from the basement into the main living room, we noticed that almost all the original furniture was still intact. There were heavy velvet couches covered in dust, an ancient grand piano with yellowed keys, and family portraits hanging crookedly on the peeling walls. We spent the first hour exploring the grand ballroom and the expansive kitchen, taking dozens of artistic photos for our social media accounts. Everything felt peaceful, albeit deeply creepy. However, as the sun began to set outside, casting long, bloody red shadows through the cracks in the boarded windows, the atmosphere inside the mansion shifted drastically. We were exploring the second-floor master bedroom when Maya suddenly stopped walking. She raised her hand, signaling for Liam and me to be quiet. "Did you guys hear that?" she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. We stood perfectly still, holding our breath, listening intently to the silence of the house. A few seconds passed, and then we heard it. A distinct, heavy thud coming from the floor directly above us. It sounded exactly like someone dropping a heavy book onto the hardwood floor of the third-floor attic. My heart skipped a beat. We assumed that perhaps a stray raccoon or an owl had managed to get inside through a broken roof tile. But then, the sound changed. It became a series of slow, deliberate, rhythmic footsteps walking right across the ceiling directly over our heads. Creak, creak, creak. Someone was upstairs. Liam, who was always the most adventurous and stubborn member of our group, shook his head. "It's probably just another urban explorer or a homeless squatter," he whispered firmly. "Let's just go up there, let them know we're here, so we don't scare each other." Maya and I were deeply hesitant, but we didn't want to leave Liam to go up there alone. We slowly crept out of the bedroom and walked down the long, dark corridor toward the narrow spiral staircase that led to the third floor. The staircase was completely shrouded in pitch-black shadow. We kept our flashlights pointed upward as we slowly climbed the creaking steps. One by one, when we reached the top landing, we found a heavy wooden door that stood slightly ajar. Liam pushed the door open, the rusty hinges letting out a loud, piercing shriek that echoed throughout the entire mansion. We shined our flashlights into the attic space. It was a massive, cavernous room, filled with old wooden crates, trunks, and covered furniture. At first glance, the room appeared entirely empty, but as I swept my flashlight beam across the far corner of the attic, the light illuminated something that made my stomach instantly drop into a bottomless pit of terror. Sitting on a small children's rocking chair in the center of a cleared space was a modern, brightly colored plastic cooler. Surrounding the cooler were several fresh, empty fast food wrappers and a half-empty bottle of milk that hadn't even expired yet. This wasn't the setup of a homeless person or a casual trespasser. Someone was actively living up here in complete comfort. Before we could even process what we were looking at, a sudden, violent sound cut through the silence. The heavy wooden attic door behind us was violently slammed shut with incredible force. Bam! We spun around frantically, shining our lights toward the door. Standing right in front of the exit was a massive man. He was wearing a filthy, blood-stained yellow rain poncho, despite the clear weather outside, and his face was entirely covered by a crude, homemade mask made of thick burlap, with two mismatched eye holes cut into it. In his right hand, he was gripping a massive rusted machete, the long metal blade scraping slowly against the floorboards. "Screech, get the hell out of my house!" the man screamed in a deep, booming voice that sounded completely unhinged. He didn't hesitate. He lunged forward, swinging the massive machete wildly in our direction. The blade narrowly missed Liam's shoulder, slicing deeply into a cardboard box next to him, showering us with old papers. "Run!" I screamed at the top of my lungs. The attic was a chaotic maze of crates and furniture. We scrambled backward, throwing old trunks and chairs behind us to slow the attacker down. The man in the burlap mask was relentless, violently hacking through the wooden obstacles with his machete, let out loud guttural roars of pure rage. Maya tripped over a rolled-up rug, crashing heavily onto the floor. The man raised his machete over her body, preparing to strike. Liam bravely lunged forward, grabbed a heavy vintage typewriter from a desk, and threw it with all his might directly at the man's chest. The heavy typewriter struck the man hard, knocking him backward and causing him to drop the machete onto the floorboards. Maya scrambled to her feet, tears streaming down her face, and we ran past the dazed attacker toward the attic door. We threw the door open and sprinted down the spiral staircase like lunatics, not caring about the creaking wood or the danger of falling. Behind us, we could hear the heavy, furious footsteps of the man chasing us down the stairs. He had recovered his machete and was coming after us with terrifying speed. We reached the first floor, sprinted through the grand living room, and dove headfirst through the shattered basement window that we had used to enter the mansion. I scraped my arms and legs badly on the broken glass, but the sheer adrenaline numbed the pain completely. We pulled ourselves out onto the grass and ran through the dark woods as fast as our legs could carry us, never once looking back. We reached our car, threw ourselves inside, and Liam slammed his foot on the gas pedal, tearing away from the gravel road at maximum speed. We drove directly to the nearest police station and reported the entire incident. The Chatham County Sheriff's Department launched an immediate investigation and sent a tactical unit to raid the Blackwood estate that very same night. When they searched the third-floor attic, they discovered that the man in the burlap mask was actually a highly dangerous, fugitive who had escaped from a maximum security psychiatric facility in a neighboring state 6 months prior. He had been hiding in the abandoned mansion, surviving by stalking local hikers and stealing food from nearby rural homes. Inside his attic living space, the police discovered a collection of trophies from his victims, including wallets, cell phones, and a terrifying diary detailing how he planned to trap and murder the next group of urban explorers who entered his domain. If Liam hadn't thrown that typewriter, none of us would have survived that night. I permanently quit urban exploration after that evening. Some places are abandoned for a reason, and they should stay that way. Story 2. This second story was sent in by a viewer named Brandon from a small, rural town in Ohio. It took place during the bitterly cold winter of 2023. I was 25 years old at the time and worked as a property inspector for a local bank. My job involved driving out to foreclosed, abandoned houses, taking photos of the damage, ensuring the doors were locked, and reporting back to the bank so they could prepare the properties for auctions. It was a tedious, lonely job, but it paid well, and I was used to dealing with dilapidated properties. One freezing Tuesday afternoon, around 4 o'clock, I received an assignment to inspect an old farmhouse located on a deserted county road. The house had been abandoned for over 7 years after the elderly owner passed away, and it had recently fallen into the bank's possession due to unpaid taxes. A heavy snowstorm had started to develop, blanketing the rural landscape in a thick layer of white. I pulled my truck up the long, unplowed driveway, the snow crunching loudly under my tires. The farmhouse was a bleak, depressing sight. The wooden siding was rotted, the gutters were hanging loose, and the front porch was buried under 2 feet of snow. I grabbed my digital camera, my clipboard, and my heavy industrial flashlight from the passenger seat, stepped out into the freezing wind, and walked up to the front door. The bank had provided me with the master key code for the lockbox, but when I looked at the doorknob, I noticed that the lockbox had been completely smashed open with a hammer. The front door was sitting slightly unlatched. I pushed the door open cautiously, stepping into the dark, freezing interior of the house. "Hello, property inspector, is anyone inside?" I called out loudly, my voice echoing off the bare walls. There was no answer. The house was completely silent, and the temperature inside was just as cold as it was outdoors. I clicked on my flashlight, the bright beam revealing an empty living room with peeling wallpaper and water stains on the ceiling. I began my standard inspection routine, walking from room to room, taking photos of the structural damage, checking the plumbing fixtures, and making notes on my clipboard. As I walked into the kitchen at the back of the house, I noticed a trail of dark, wet footprints on the dusty linoleum floor. The footprints didn't belong to me. They were fresh, and the snow melting from the boots had created small puddles. The tracks started from the broken back door and led directly toward the narrow wooden door that opened into the basement. I felt a sudden knot of anxiety form in my stomach. Squatters and homeless individuals frequently sought shelter in these abandoned bank properties during the freezing winter months. Normally, I would just leave immediately and call the local police to handle the eviction, as it wasn't my job to confront trespassers. But as I turned around to walk back to the front door, I heard a faint, muffled crying sound coming from behind the basement door. It sounded like a child or a young woman sobbing in pure distress. "Hello," I called out softly, stepping closer to the basement door. "Are you all right down there? Do you need medical help?" The crying suddenly stopped, replaced by a tense, suffocating silence. I hesitated for a long moment, my moral obligation to help someone in distress overriding my survival instincts. I slowly turned the brass doorknob of the basement door, pulled it open, and shined my powerful flashlight beam down the steep, dark wooden stairs. The basement was a large, unfinished concrete room filled with old boilers and discarded junk. "I'm coming down to help you," I said firmly, slowly stepping down the creaking wooden stairs, keeping my flashlight trained on the center of the room. When I reached the bottom step, the beam of my light illuminated a small, wooden chair in the far corner of the basement. Sitting on the floor next to the chair was a small, battery-powered cassette player. The wet footprints on the concrete floor led straight to the device before I could even comprehend what I was looking at. The cassette player suddenly clicked, and the muffled crying sound began playing through the small speaker once again. It was a recording. It was a decoy designed to lure me downstairs. A massive wave of pure primal terror hit me. I spun around instantly to run back up the stairs, but it was already too late. Standing at the top of the basement staircase, blocking the only exit, was a tall, incredibly gaunt man. He was wearing a dirty, oversized winter coat and holding a heavy metal crowbar in his right hand. His face was completely pale, his eyes sunken and crazed, and he was staring down at me with a horrific, sadistic smirk. Without saying a word, the man violently slammed the heavy basement door shut, and I heard the external slide bolt click into place. Clack! I was locked inside the dark basement. Panicking, I sprinted up the stairs and threw my entire body weight against the heavy wooden door, screaming for help. "Open the door! Let me out!" I yelled, slamming my fist into the solid wood. From the other side of the door, I could hear the man letting out a low, mocking laugh. Then, I heard the sound of heavy metal chains being dragged across the floor, followed by the unmistakable sound of him pouring liquid against the base of the door. A pungent, chemical odor instantly drifted through the cracks. It was gasoline. The psychotic intruder wasn't trying to rob me. He had lured me into the basement, locked the door, and was now preparing to burn the entire house down, with me trapped inside. "No, please don't do this," I screamed, tears of pure panic blinding my vision. I heard the distinct scratch of a match being struck on the other side of the wood. Within seconds, a bright orange glow appeared under the crack of the door, and a wall of thick, black smoke began pouring into the staircase. The wood was catching fire rapidly, and the air was becoming hot and suffocating. I knew I had less than 2 minutes before the smoke would overcome my lungs. I scrambled back down the stairs into the pitch-black basement, my flashlight beam shaking violently as the smoke began to fill the room. I desperately searched the concrete walls for any other escape route. In the far corner, near the ceiling, I spotted a small, rectangular awning window that opened out to the ground level of the backyard. It was covered in rust and grime, and it was bolted shut. I grabbed a heavy vintage iron car jack from a pile of junk on the basement floor, ran to the window, and began smashing it against the metal frame with all my strength. Bang, 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 the glass shattered, and the rusted metal frame finally bent outward under the immense force. The opening was incredibly small and narrow, but the basement was filling with thick, toxic smoke, and I couldn't breathe. I threw my clipboard and camera out through the opening, grabbed the concrete ledge, and desperately pulled my body upward into the narrow gap. I squeezed my torso through, the jagged glass and bent metal tearing deeply into my winter coat and skin. But I didn't care. I wrestled my hips through and tumbled out onto the freezing, snow-covered grass of the backyard, gasping for fresh air. As I lay in the snow, coughing violently, I looked up and saw that the entire first floor of the farmhouse was already engulfed in massive, roaring orange flames. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my truck keys from my pocket, and ran around the side of the house to the driveway. My truck was still running, and I threw myself into the driver's seat, shifting into drive and tearing down the snow-covered road until I reached a main intersection where I could get cell phone reception to dial 911. The volunteer fire department and the state police arrived 20 minutes later, but the old wooden farmhouse was completely burned to the ground, leaving nothing but a smoking concrete foundation. The police searched the surrounding woods for the tall man with the crowbar, following a set of footprints in the snow that led to a nearby highway intersection, where tire tracks indicated he had escaped in a vehicle. The investigation revealed that this individual was a suspected serial arsonist who had been burning down foreclosed homes across the state, using the exact same cassette player trap to murder property inspectors and real estate agents. He was never apprehended, and he remains a ghost in the system. I resigned from my job at the bank the very next morning, and I will never step foot inside an abandoned property again for the rest of my life. Story 3. Our final story takes place in July of 2021 in a quiet, wealthy, suburban neighborhood in northern New Jersey. My name is Julian, and at the time, I was a 22-year-old food delivery driver working for a popular smartphone application. Because it was the height of the summer, I preferred working the late-night shifts between midnight and 4 in the morning, as the roads were completely empty, and the tips from hungry college students staying up late playing video games were usually excellent. It was a warm, humid Saturday night. Around 2:30 in the morning, I received an order for a large premium pizza and a 2-liter bottle of soda from a high-end Italian restaurant that stayed open late. The delivery address was located at the end of a long, winding cul-de-sac in an affluent neighborhood, known for its massive colonial-style homes. I drove my car up the dark, tree-lined street, looking for the house numbers. When I reached the end of the cul-de-sac, my headlights illuminated the target property. It was a massive, beautiful mansion, but as I pulled into the driveway, I noticed that something was deeply wrong. The manicured lawn was completely overgrown with tall weeds. The driveway was cracked and covered in dead leaves, and there were several faded for sale and bank foreclosed signs posted near the entrance. The windows were completely dark, and the entire property had an unmistakable aura of total abandonment. I pulled out my phone to double-check the delivery address on the application. The address matched perfectly, and there was a specific note left by the customer that read, "Please bring the food to the back door around the side of the house. The front doorbell is broken. Knock loudly." I hesitated for a moment, sitting in the safety of my locked car. It was incredibly unusual for someone to order food to a clearly abandoned mansion in the middle of the night. I assumed that perhaps a group of local teenagers had broken inside to throw a party, or a squatter had taken up residence inside the vacant property. Knowing that if I canceled the order without a valid reason, my driver rating would suffer, I decided to grab the insulated pizza box and the soda bottle, step out into the warm night air, and walk down the driveway. The side of the mansion was shrouded in pitch-black shadow. I used my phone's built-in flashlight to guide my steps along a stone walkway that led to the backyard. The silence of the neighborhood was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic chirping of crickets in the bushes. I reached the back patio, which featured a large, empty swimming pool covered in a dirty tarp. The back door of the house was a massive glass sliding door covered by thin white curtains from the inside. I walked up to the glass door and knocked loudly on the frame. "Food delivery. I have your order," I called out into the darkness. There was no immediate response. I stood there for a minute, feeling increasingly anxious, preparing to turn around and leave the food on the porch. Suddenly, the thin white curtains inside the sliding door were slowly pulled aside. A man stood on the other side of the glass, He was wearing an elegant, expensive business suit, but his appearance was deeply disheveled. His hair was messy, his tie was loose, and his face was completely covered in dark sweat. He had a bizarre, frozen, unblinking stare that made my skin crawl. He slowly slid the glass door open a few inches, releasing a blast of icy, freezing air from inside the house. The central air conditioning was running at maximum capacity, which was strange for an abandoned foreclosed home. Ah, yes, the delivery. Thank you, the man said in a completely flat, robotic tone. He didn't look at the pizza. His wide, unblinking eyes were locked onto my face. That will be $45, sir, I said, trying to maintain a professional demeanor despite my growing urge to run away. The man reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out a thick stack of crisp $100 bills, and handed me one. Keep the change, he whispered, but I need a small favor. The electronic payment terminal inside is broken, and I need help carrying a heavy tables from the basement up to the living room. I will give you another $100 if you help me for just 5 minutes. A normal person would have been tempted by the easy money, but every single survival instinct in my brain was screaming at me that this situation was a massive trap. Why was a man in a business suit staying in an abandoned mansion, ordering pizza at 3 in the morning, and offering $100 to a random delivery guy to go into his basement? It made absolutely no sense. No, thank you, sir, I said firmly, stepping backward away from the door. Company policy strictly prohibits drivers from entering a customer's residence. I have to get back to my vehicle for another delivery. The moment the refusal left my mouth, the man's polite, professional expression completely vanished. His face twisted into a look of pure animalistic malice. He let out a strange, clicking sound from his throat and violently lunged forward out of the sliding door, reaching his hands out to grab my shirt collar. I dodged backward instinctively, dropping the insulated pizza box and the soda bottle onto the concrete patio. The bottle exploded, showering us in dark liquid. I turned around and sprinted down the stone walkway toward the front driveway as fast as I could. Behind me, I heard the rapid, heavy footsteps of the man chasing me through the dark. He wasn't running like a normal human being. He was moving with incredible speed, his limbs flailing wildly, letting out high-pitched, screeching noises like a wild animal. I reached the front driveway, threw myself into the driver's seat of my car, and frantically slammed my hand onto the door lock button. A split second later, the man threw his entire body weight onto the hood of my car. He crawled up the windshield, his sweat-streaked face pressed hard against the glass, violently slamming his fists into the windshield pane. Bang, bang, bang. The glass began to web and crack under his immense, unnatural strength. His wide, crazed eyes were staring directly into mine, his mouth wide open as he screamed incoherently. I was completely paralyzed with fear for a second. Before my survival instincts kicked in, I started the engine, threw the car into reverse, and slammed my foot onto the accelerator. The car surged backward down the long driveway, and the sudden momentum threw the man off the hood. He crashed heavily onto the hard asphalt, rolling several times. I shifted into drive, pulled the steering wheel sharply, and sped out of the cul-de-sac, my tires smoking as I flew down the suburban streets. I didn't stop driving until I reached a well-lit police precinct in the next town. I gave my statement to the desk sergeant, showing him the cracked windshield and the crisp $100 bill the man had given me. The police immediately dispatched 3 patrol cars to investigate the foreclosed mansion. When they raided the property, they found the abandoned pizza box on the patio, but the man in the suit was gone. However, inside the freezing house, the police made a gruesome discovery that made national headlines the following week. In the basement of the mansion, Officers discovered the bodies of the actual real estate agent who owned the listing, along with another delivery driver who had gone missing 2 days prior. The man in the suit was a highly dangerous, wealthy psychopath who had lost his sanity after a corporate bankruptcy. He had been utilizing the vacant, foreclosed properties he found online to lure innocent service workers to their deaths, pretending to be a legitimate customer. The crisp $100 bills he used were counterfeit, part of a massive stash he had created before his downfall. He was captured by federal agents a month later at an international airport. I immediately quit my food delivery job and took a secure office position. That abandoned mansion taught me that behind the beautiful exterior of the suburbs, a complete monster could be waiting for you in the dark.